right. Well, what I'm going to start with is a critical look at deer management and sort of walk you through some of the assumptions that people have about deer and deer problems and to what extent they can be resolved through removal or different kinds of options. So, all right, what do you do about the deer issue? This is the context, right? You've got legislators, municipalities, oops, can't hear me? Okay. You've got these politicians who are trying to figure out what to do, town council people, and you've got people protesting. You've got people who have deer problems, you have people who want to hunt, you have people who don't want them to hunt, you've got deer eating gardens, you've got going into bird feeders, you've got protests, you've got neighbor pitted against neighbor. And it's an ugly situation. And this occurs in towns and cities across the country because there's all these competing forces that come to play when it concerns deer. And so it's a tough issue. There are no easy solutions. That's what I want to say right up front. But we do have a number of positive and good things we can recommend, productive things we can recommend. But this is a hot issue in towns and cities across the country. The deer problem is really one of our own making. Socially, if you think about the suburban landscape, it's the perfect edge habitat where forest meets grassland. And it creates this edge which deer thrive in. And suburbia is perfect for them. So deer are drawn into our suburban landscape and they exist at high levels, and their impact on the landscape can be very keenly felt by people who don't really appreciate it. Here's the bottom line. We have put out a welcome mat. We have provided this bounty of food. We've provided a virtual buffet between what we plant, our landscaping, our flowers. I mean, it's like for deer, it's like the Haagen-Dazs of the deer world. So they come in, they come to feed, and it's no surprise because we're attracting them through the plantings that we put around our homes. And of course, the outcome is that people say there's too many deer. Well, they perceive too many deer because of the impacts they don't like. So what I want to look at some deer management assumptions to start with, and then also summarize some non-lethal deer problem mitigation methods and applications that can be used to help communities alleviate the problems with deer. All right, here are some of the management assumptions I'm going to run through. Lethal methods. Killing deer will control the deer population, reduce garden damage, reduce significantly lower deer car collisions, reduce human risk of Lyme disease, and restore biodiversity. I mean, these are the main arguments used to promote the killing of deer. Does hunting control deer? Well, there's a confounding effect. Well-fed deer have an adaptive response to their nutritional condition. When they're well-fed, they tend to breed at an earlier age. They tend to maybe have more fawns instead of a singleton. They may have twins or even triplets. They have lower neonatal mortality, which means less of their fawns will die, and they have higher survival rates. So all told, it results in more fawns being born. The result is this rebound effect. You have a population decline, you may have deer killed through hunting or some management program, and then this compensatory reproductive mechanism kicks in, and deer suddenly rebound. Here's what it looks like. This is Angel Island in California. These are black-tailed deer, not white-tailed deer that we have. But if you look carefully, you'll see the population went up and down, but there was a concerted effort to remove deer in around 1980, I think, 2, where they brought down the population by 215 deer. And what you saw was over the next year or so, the deer numbers bounced back up. They removed 112. Deer numbers bounced back up. They removed 25. But you see this yo-yo effect, essentially. You reduce the population, they pop back up, you reduce them again, and it's sort of an endless cycle. It's really counterintuitive. I mean, when people think about it, does hunting, how does that trigger population growth? If you hunt deer, you reduce them. They should go to a lower population level. But what happens is that it stimulates deer to have a higher reproductive rate. And there are studies which underscore this. And as a Yale Forestry School student, I really like to look at the science behind deer management and deer population biology. For example, at the University of Florida, there was a study done. They looked at the incidence of twinning, deer having two fawns. And what they found was that deer had 14% on twinning was 14% on unhunted sites, but 38% on comparable hunted sites. So literally, the twinning rate more than doubled on hunted sites. So it just shows you this reproductive response. Culling really can be a never-ending battle because it is hard to reduce deer numbers, but when you do succeed at lowering their population, how do you keep them at that lower level? It's hard because you're up against this higher reproductive potential. They have more fawns, the fawns survive, they reproduce at a younger age, and you get this bounce back. There's also a reduction in hunter success. When deer numbers go down, more hunting effort is required to take out the same number of deer. You need more hunters, and you need them to put in more effort. And often hunter satisfaction is lower when there's a lower number of deer, so you get less interest in hunting some of the sites with less deer. Plus, there's the problem of immigration. This is Saddle River, New Jersey, surrounded by green space. If you pluck out deer, what happens is more deer from the surrounding area move in. And it's difficult to keep an area deer-free. So my best recommendation is really communities need to focus on reducing deer conflicts. Not try and manage overall numbers, but rather really focus in on the conflicts. And that means committing to a deer conflict management plan, collecting data on what the problems are, where they occur, and apply site-specific solutions. So here's my best recommendation for a wildlife problem-solving strategy, whether it's deer or any other wild animal. It's kind of three-pronged. You want to change the landscape to decrease the food for the animal you're trying to control, and decrease food and shelter. You want to change the human behavior that creates the problem, and that's usually a big part of the problem. And you want to also change the animal behavior that creates the problem, particularly with deer. If they're coming in for food, how do we get them to stop that? We have a bunch of tools in the toolbox. There are deer-resistant plants that people can plant. There are repellents. Some are much better than others. Some are very effective. Some are not. There's fencing, netting. There's a whole bunch of deterrent and exclusion options. How do you keep deer from eating your flowers? Big question. The answer is really you need to make smart choices because deer numbers are a function of their food source. So the best way to reduce their presence and their numbers is to limit the food availability. So if you live in deer country, you absolutely cannot have tulips. I'm sorry, you may love them, out of the question. You can have a dazzling array of daffodils. They're beautiful, equally beautiful. But you need, these are plants that deer will not touch. So you need to be very selective in picking what you plant. There are a lot of deer-resistant flower choices. Number of cooperative extension services have put out lists, but there are really beautiful flowers that you can plant that deer really don't tend to like. And there are a number of good resources available to you. Cooperative extension, there are some studies. Here's some websites, but even garden stores will have good choices for you. But there's things you can plant that deer don't like to eat. So my attitude is plant those instead of the things like tulips that we love, but deer do too. Exclusion methods. There's a number of ways to exclude deer. Woven wire fences in the middle, on the left. 8 to 10 feet tall will keep deer out. That's the best choice if you want to keep deer out of an area. But there's also things you can do like tree shelters on the, let's see, right here. There it is. Tree shelters to protect different growing plants. There's deer netting. right here in the middle, and other kinds of mesh barriers. So there's a lot you can do to keep deer away from growing plants. There are a number of electric fencing varieties. There's these polytape or polywire fences you can use, something like a 3D scented anti-deer fence, which is wiring that comes with these little sachets of attractants that deer will smell and come along and lick or smell, and it will zap them. There are slanted 7-wire fences, there are electric wire fence kits, and there are these single wire peanut butter fences, which is a single wire of electric fencing with aluminum foil attached that you smear peanut butter on, and the deer come along, they lick the peanut butter, they get zapped, and that teaches them to stay away. Maintenance is everything. When you're using electric fencing, you really need to make sure it doesn't get overcome by growing grass. You should bait it. I mean, you want to draw the deer in, you want to teach them a lesson, so it's always good to do something to bring them in so they lick the aluminum foil, they get a little zap, and they learn. And you need to mow to make sure grasses don't interfere with the electric wiring. There's a number of exclusion kits. There are all kinds of kits on the marketplace, home garden fence kits, which you can set up very easily to protect a garden from deer. Here's a very creative garden fence that I saw. There are many designs that can keep deer away. And there are scare devices. I mean, physical exclusion is always the best because it prevents deer from getting to something, some sort of plants that you don't want them to get to. But there are scare devices. The Scarecrow motion-activated sprinkler is one of the more popular. What it is, you hook it up to your hose, and it's got a motion sensor, so when you can set it to a certain level, and when a big animal like a deer comes along, it spritzes them, it hits them with a bolt of water, and takes them off guard and scares them. Here is, down below, here is Have a Heart Spray Away Elite, which is essentially the same thing. It's solar powered. There are these electronic deer repellers, which are stakes you can put up around a garden, and when a deer comes to sniff them, it gives them a little electrical shock, not harmful, but just enough to convince them to stay away. And here's Deer Shield, which is a device that emits alarm calls, distress calls of deer on an intermittent basis that makes them nervous and keeps them away. So these are things people can do to protect their yards and gardens from deer. The funny part with a Scarecrow motion-activated sprinkler is people set it at a certain level and they keep it there, and then, like, say their husband will go out to look at the garden and bam, he gets hit with a bolt of water. So it's kind of comical, the outcome from some of these things. Repellents can work, but there are differences in repellents. You cannot let feeding patterns get established. You can't let deer start feeding and then apply repellents. You have to apply them before bud break, before the deer start feeding, and reapply frequently after any heavy rains, because the rain will wash it off, or every 2 weeks to keep the repellent fresh. The most effective repellents are those that emit a sulfurous odor, a rotten egg odor. There have been a number of studies done. We don't know why these repellents are the most successful. Maybe there's a predator association, carnage, or spoiled food. There's been a lot of theories proposed at conferences I've gone to, but nobody really knows. But rotten egg seems to work. My favorite is Liquid Fence. It's one product. I have no commercial interest in this company, but their product seems to be the best for whatever reason and the most effective. And I have an ongoing battle with a deer in my backyard. So, and I'm an avid gardener, so I can attest to the effectiveness of Liquid Fence. Okay, so what can communities do? Well, they need to educate their residents. They really need to help them out. They need to give them good educational information, maybe on the town or city website on deer-resistant gardening. Maybe sponsor some deer-proof gardening workshops, partner with garden stores in the community on deer products, give discounts on certain days. Absolutely implement feeding bans. feeding bans are interesting. A lot of communities do them, but I'm not sure how successful they are because people's hackles go up when they're told they can't do something they enjoy doing. They just kind of go underground or do it in a different way. I think feeding bans are important, but they don't always get the most compliant reaction from people. And it's really important to cut the food sources in a community. We've gone into different communities and looked at the deer problem. And I can't tell you, just about every community I've gone into has had these roadside flower beds that contain only plant varieties that deer love. Tulips and all kinds of flowers that are pulling deer in. Some of them are right in the middle of roadways. It's like attracting deer in to be hit by cars. It's really important to work with the community and say, where are we attracting deer? Is it the garden club plantings? Is it these roadside flower beds? Bird feeders are a big attractant to deer because the spillage is something they like to eat. So these are things that communities need to look at and say, hey, we need to do better. Now with roadside plantings, they can just switch the variety of flowers that they plant and use daffodils and other things that deer don't like. We're not trying to get rid of the roadside plantings, we're just trying to get them to use more deer-resistant varieties. Okay, now I'm going to jump to, will hunting reduce Lyme disease in people, which is, Lyme disease is a huge issue in every community I've ever gone to. And people are scared of deer because they're scared of Lyme disease. What they don't realize is that deer are one host in a multi-host cycle. The black-legged tick is carried by so many different species. It really is a multi-host disease. Birds, common songbirds that people love, will transport the disease to new areas through the ticks. Deer are the preferred host for the adult ticks, but they are not the only host, and they're not the most important host. So what happens when you try and reduce deer, when you try and pluck out deer, what you have is you're taking out one host of a multi-host disease. If you want to really remove hosts for control of this disease, you're going to have to target mice, squirrels, chipmunks, deer, songbirds, shrews, lizards, really every fur-bearing animal and birds. It's virtually impossible. Killing deer just doesn't take out enough ticks. Yes, deer are the preferred host for the adult ticks, but even if you take out all the deer, there are enough hosts left behind to host them. So it just doesn't work to try and pluck out hosts. And the ticks are really adaptable. When deer numbers are reduced, what we see through the scientific studies, ticks tend to congregate in higher densities on the remaining deer, or they switch to other hosts. They're smart, they're very adaptable. So is there a greater human safety risk after deer are removed? Well, what's interesting is when you pluck out deer, it can lead to disease hotspots because the questing deer who are looking for a large host may end up on people. For some reason we don't understand, ticks tend to prefer a progressively larger host. We don't know why. So if deer are removed from the equation, they're going to look for another large host. And some of the studies that I read said the public is advised to be extra vigilant after deer numbers are reduced because these ticks are looking for large hosts, meaning people, dogs, anything that's large. There are confounding variables. The regular hunting season occurs too late to affect the reproduction of ticks. For example, in September and November, female ticks are engorging on their host, their final host, deer, and laying eggs. But they're done with that. They've dropped off the deer. So by the time hunting season occurs, the female ticks have already dropped off the deer and are laying eggs. So hunting is not effective at reducing those ticks. What about the success cases? Well, we hear about a lot of deer hunt success cases. And usually they're on small islands and they involve the elimination of deer, like Great Island. 70% of the deer were removed, but what they found was that there was no marked reduction in tick abundance. So then they went ahead and removed more deer, virtually almost eliminated them. And they found that the subadult ticks did decline, but the adult tick numbers increased in subsequent years for reasons unknown. Crane's Beach is another study that's used to justify killing deer to control Lyme disease, and they removed over 83% of the deer over 7 years. What they found is there was no precipitous decline in immature ticks. It took about 5 to 7 years, but interestingly, the adult tick density increased for reasons unknown. And in the final 2 years, the nymph ticks, the second stage, there's larval, nymph, and adult ticks. The nymph ticks rose to the same level as when sampling began. So essentially, this huge deer reduction really didn't reduce the ticks. So they did find less ticks, particularly the larval ticks, but infected ticks remained abundant. So even removing over 83% of the deer did not reduce enough infected ticks. So how low do deer numbers need to go in order to reduce infected ticks? Some people say that under 8 deer per square mile is enough to result in less disease to people and to disrupt the tick reproductive cycle. But how do you accomplish that? And is 8 deer per square mile even low enough to reduce human disease? We look at Cape Cod in Massachusetts. The deer population is 6 to 8 deer per square mile. It's very low, yet they have extremely high rates of Lyme disease. So reducing deer levels really low doesn't seem to have reduced Lyme disease. Does it reduce human disease when you reduce deer? Here's Bernard Township in New Jersey. They reduced deer from 17 to 9 deer per square mile. They monitored them for 3 seasons. And what they found was that the killing of deer didn't affect the subadult deer numbers, and that the host-seeking ticks increased by the second year. So in essence, Lyme disease incidence in people didn't vary with the deer decline that they had accomplished. So, it just didn't seem to work. The bottom line is culling doesn't seem to remove enough ticks to interrupt the tick's reproductive cycle and reduce Lyme disease. So even when you get deer numbers very low, you're still not getting rid of enough ticks and interrupting their reproductive cycle. And that's why the CDC and health authorities really don't recommend killing deer to reduce Lyme disease risk to people, because it doesn't work. So what does work? Well, there's a number of tools. There's this 4-poster deer treatment station, which was tested by the USDA. It's perethrum treated rollers that you see on the lower right-hand corner. These rollers, the deer come to a corn bait, and when they do, these rollers put a perethrum-based acaricide on their necks, and that helps to kill ticks. And what they found was that over 95% of the ticks on 90% of the deer were killed in a 50-acre study area, and they eliminated adult ticks by the second year, and all tick stages, larval, nymph, and adult, were killed by the third year to a high proportion. So this seems to work very well. There are issues with it, though, because you're putting out a corn bait, you're feeding deer, you're feeding other animals that come in. There are some issues. It's not a perfect system, but it just shows you this is one of the approaches that has some potential if the kinks can be worked out. There are also devices which use mice to kill ticks, because what they found is human risk of exposure to disease is correlated with the abundance of immature tick hosts like mice, shrews, and chipmunks, and their food, acorns, not necessarily deer. So there are products which target mice. You can't kill off enough mice to reduce Lyme disease. But here's one of the products. It's called the Daminix tick tube. And what it is this tube with perethrum-treated cotton balls. And the idea is that, here's what it looks like. The mice will take these cotton balls and use them for nesting material, and they're perethrum treated so they kill the ticks. So mice grab them on a property, they use them to nest, and the ticks are killed at that first stage. And here's another item that's used with mice. It's called the Tick Control System, TCS, very original name, Tick Control System. And these are systems which attract mice into the box, and it uses fipronil, which is used, the active ingredient in Frontline, to control ticks in dogs. And there's a study done to show in the Journal of Medical Entomology how effective it is. Here's what it looks like. So the mouse comes into this bait box. They're attracted to the bait, and they go in. Let me show you right here. Okay, here. So they're going into the bait box, number 2, and then they go in number 3. They get the bait, and you see this little hook that's a wick full of fipronil. So when they go to eat the bait, they're coated with this acaricide, which kills ticks while they eat the bait, and then they leave the bait box, and the ticks that are on them die. And so this is a way to control that early stage of tick using mice as a killing machine. But the best protective measures people can have is really doing self-body checks within 24 hours of being outdoors. I mean, there's a number of things people can do. There's a number of things that are prescribed by the health departments, but really the most effective is when you're outdoors, tucking your pants into your socks, wearing light colored clothing, but really checking yourself at night, checking your family, seeing if there are any ticks, because it takes the ticks about 36 hours to latch on and transmit the bacterium that transmits Lyme disease. So you've got a good window there. So if every night everybody who takes a shower thoroughly inspects themselves for ticks, that is the best way to prevent Lyme disease. Educating the public is important. Town websites really need to address this issue. Maybe consider the use of 4 posters, but really, that body check is everything. Okay, now I'm going to jump to, decrease deer car collisions, which is a huge issue. Well, collisions are a result of many factors. Deer are attracted to salted roads, to the succulent vegetation on roadside that are on roads everywhere, mowed roads. The continual development of habitat. I mean, deer are used to going through certain pathways, and then when those areas are developed, they still keep going through those pathways and crossing roads. There's increasing car volume and speeds, which prevent drivers from being able to stop in time. And so even if collision numbers increase, there's a lot of reasons. People tend to say, deer, there's too many deer, their deer numbers have grown, and there's more collisions, but actually there's more drivers on the road, and there's more drivers that are diverted with their iPhones and texting. There's a lot of reasons that deer car collisions have increased. We really need about 10 years of data to assess the trends. But in Virginia, the Department of Transportation did a study. They geolocated all the collisions in a certain county, Clark County, along 228 road segments. And they looked at what factors correlate with collisions. They looked at hunting pressure, deer density, amount of forest, amount of housing, the presence of crops, speed, limit, car volume. And what they found was that there was little evidence to support that increased deer harvest reduced collisions. There were other factors at play. There have been different results. This isn't the conclusive study. Millburn, New Jersey did a public hunting study, and they found that deer car collisions didn't decline over 8 years, versus a study that was done of sharpshooting of deer, and they found that up to 76% of the deer population being reduced in 3 communities did lead to less deer car collisions. So kind of the jury is out on to what extent deer numbers being reduced has resulted in less deer car collisions. Okay, there's a number of things. Slower speed limits have been shown to result in less collisions. I went to a conference which looked at all kinds of factors related to deer car collisions, and what they found was that lower speed limits, under 45 miles an hour resulted in far less collisions. However, how practical is that, right? Most roadways, the speed limit is 65, 70. You can't bring down the speed limit enough to get people to really drive at the level that they'll have less collisions. There's active or motion sensing signage, which can flag to people, hey, there's a deer crash, or slow down for deer. More bumps, more fencing, always effective. Driver awareness has been huge in terms of reducing deer car collision. There's different devices like these streeter lights. I don't know if any of you have heard of them, but what they do, they reflect the headlights of a car to create this optical illusion of a fence at night. So deer will, when a car comes along, deer will see this fence that isn't there, and that will stop them in their tracks. There's been varied results in terms of how effective these are. Some communities say they're really effective, some say they're not. But one of the things is in winter, the reflectors get clogged with snow being hit, and they need to be cleaned on a regular basis by the Public Works Department in order to work effectively. So that may have impacted some of the studies. Okay, in Rochester Hills, they did a program which they initiated called Don't Veer for Deer, because they had way too many deer car collisions. It was coordinated by the city and the city council. And what they based their program on was that there would be these movable, changeable message boards put at collision hotspots so that people be warned, this is a collision hotspot, slow down. They also reduced sightline barriers along roadways. They went door to door. They cruised around throughout the community. They looked at where there were shrub or other vegetative barriers that would impede sightlines, and they talked to homeowners about mowing them, cutting them back. They wanted to really get rid of any sightline barriers. They did a big public education component on deer-resistant gardening, defensive driving, and they put forth a number of educational workshops and really tried to get the community involved in learning to live with deer and reducing problems. They collected collision data on type of accident and a lot of details: the location, the month, the day of the week, the time period, road conditions, light conditions, weather, injuries. Really tried to get a good sense of, what are the collisions, when do they occur, how could we possibly reduce them. And they also measured deer density by aerial survey every year. Not so much that they were trying for a target deer population level, but they just wanted an indice. Are deer increasing, decreasing? Where are we with our deer population? What they found was that deer car collisions declined 25% after their program began, despite an increase in the deer herd size. Their complaints decreased 75% in 1 year. Their accidents were reduced, and their task force meets regularly to monitor the program and to do regular aerial deer counts and really try and stay on top of the program. The ongoing cost is only $5,000 to $10,000 a year. So it's a very cost-effective program to try and deal with deer problems. So what can communities do? I think they can learn from Rochester Hills, collect really good accident data, identify the hot spots and establish a baseline, and really try to develop a deer collision reduction plan using movable, changeable message boards, and reducing sightline barriers in places where they tend to have a high proportion of accidents, trying to slow down driver speed wherever possible, and in terms of public education, really helping to teach people defensive driving, and doing a lot of public outreach and reaching out to new drivers, whether they're new or actually elderly drivers who tend to have a surprisingly high percentage of accidents. Okay, now I'm going to jump again, because I know we have limited time, to will culling bring back biodiversity? This is a big argument that people use to support killing programs. Will killing deer really help to bring back biodiversity? Well, I want to just throw it to you. We tend to equate a healthy environment with one that's biodiverse and in an early successional stage, because as forests mature, they become less biodiverse. The growing trees tend to shade out other trees and bushes, and it's part of the natural process that succession will occur, and the most biodiverse stages are the early stages. So we tend to like that. But if we like that, we have to manage for it. We can't expect nature to provide us with all this biodiversity. It's really a human value judgment. We want to see a lot of biodiversity, but it doesn't mean that nature should provide that to us, because that's not what nature does as forests mature. Plants are affected by a number of factors: drought, acid rain, insect damage, all these things listed here. So when you look at a forest community or even a backyard community, there are a number of processes going on. Your plants are fighting herbivory, insects, invasive plants. There's so many forces at work, including deer, but there's many more things that impede the growth of native species. You need to be aware of cause and effect assumptions. Now, I was a grad student at the Yale School of Forestry, and we looked at the Yale forest deer exclosure, which was an area that was fenced off that deer could not get into. And what we were looking at is, what is the impact of deer on oak regeneration? Deer love oak. So we were looking at that. And what we found was that no oak were growing outside the exclosure, but actually no oak seedlings were growing inside the exclosure either. So in the areas where deer were not allowed to impede oak growth, oak still were not growing, so something else was going on. It'd be very easy to have blamed deer for no oak regeneration at the Yale Myers Forest, but actually we looked at millipede damage and a number of other things that were impeding oaks. So very easy to make assumptions about what deer are doing that's negatively impacting the environment, but you have to make sure it's really deer that are having that impact. Are deer responsible for the loss of pink lady slipper? This is an argument we hear a lot. There's no pink lady slippers. The deer have eaten them all. Well, what we're finding is that pink lady slippers need an open, sunny habitat to stimulate and attract pollinators. If they don't have that, if the areas they're growing in become shaded, they're not going to be able to grow. So poor reproductive performance was seen in those plants that were in those shaded areas where pollinators couldn't get to them. So it had nothing to do with the deer. It had everything to do with the pollinators. But again, you'll see in community after community, people are lamenting the loss of pink lady slippers because of the deer population. So what we push for, and this is not my words, but a study, we suggest managers use plant community metrics rather than looking at a single indicator species like pink lady slippers to monitor how much deer are eating. And those metrics are, looking at the percent of non-vegetated ground cover, species diversity, floristic quality. There are a lot of things to be looked at, but don't just blame the deer because you're not seeing a certain flower or plant that you want to see, is my message to you. Deer do impact ecosystems, but the problems they're blamed for are much broader, complex, and multifaceted. So managers may want to decrease deer for other reasons, but the rationale that you're decreasing them to decrease damage to vegetation really needs to be reevaluated. And this was a study that I encourage you to look at, done by one of my mentors at Yale, who looked at, impacts of deer on the landscape. So there are tools for increasing the understory and plant diversity. You can have permanent or movable fencing, canopy thinning, small patch cuts. I mean, we can borrow from what the forestry industry does to bring about more vegetative changes. There's liming the soil, fertilization, stem protectors. There's a lot of things that can be done to bring about the kind of forest ecosystem that people want to see. With lethal methods, there are a number of problems. Are lethal methods effective? How do you counter the bounce back? And are lethal methods socially acceptable? These are all big issues. As you see on the graph on the right, there's a deer population that's been hunted. It goes down, pops back up, goes down, pops back up. That's what you get with deer. They are so resilient, they are so adaptable, and reproductively, they can bounce back. If you're a community leader, you may want something done to address all the deer complaints that you're getting, but the issue is you've got to make sure that what you're doing achieves your goals. It can't just be lip service. It can't just be doing something that looks like it's solving the problem, but really isn't. For example, in Weston, Massachusetts, it was a community I was involved with. The archers killed 18 deer over a 6-week hunt. They declared it a success for controlling deer numbers. But when we crunched the numbers, they had 25 deer per square mile, about over 400 deer. So removing 18 deer took out 4% of the deer herd. Removing 4% of the deer herd really did not have a significant impact on deer numbers. Humane issues aside, just looking from a numbers perspective, this was not an effective way to achieve a goal. The conditions in cities and suburbs are not conducive often for controlling deer by hunting, because you have a lot of people and a lot of deer. You have safety mandated hunting restrictions. You may have buffers in different communities where people cannot shoot within. Quite frankly, hunters don't want to be out in suburban areas shooting deer. It's not attractive to them. It's not appealing for very understandable reasons, and it pits neighbor against neighbor. When hunters are in people's backyards, there's a lot of anger. People are angry at each other for allowing deer hunting, for not. And so hunters tend to not want to be in suburban backyards where problems may be occurring. There's a lot of negative PR potential, and we've seen that in a number of places. So big questions. Even if deer are only hunted on town green space, how will that impact backyard deer problems? You know, you hunt the deer in one area. Is that going to have any effect on the people who are complaining about deer browsing their gardens? Will it even significantly reduce deer numbers with the bounce back? And will other recreation be impeded? If you want to go hiking, or a town has a public green space that now needs to be closed to residents, they're going to be angry. There's a lot of direct and indirect costs. With bow hunting, it's not a quick kill. A big part of bow hunting is following the blood trail. And you can read about it in different publications. So my questions are, okay, if an archer kills a deer in a hunted parcel, what happens when that deer runs off into an unhunted parcel? Will they be given permission to trespass? Before a hunt is initiated, will all the adjoining landowners be asked for trespass permission? Should a deer be shot on a hunted area and then run off into an area that's not? Bow hunting can have very high crippling rates, even with modern equipment. The most modern equipment can be a very high crippling rate, and those deer can move off into areas where people don't want to see them. Sharpshooting is certainly more efficient. It's expensive. It needs to be repeated on a continuing basis, and it can be controversial, but it is the more efficient of the deer direct population control methods. Net and bolt is another method. Deer are captured, I don't know, in the Midwest, different communities are looking into this. I don't believe any community in this state is, but it's a retractable rod that is fired into the skull of the deer. It's commonly used to kill domestic livestock like cows, but there's a big difference between deer and cows because domestic animals are not scared, they're not struggling, they're not moving, whereas a deer certainly will. And everything depends on how correctly you put that rod into the skull. If there's any movement or any indirect protrusion, it can be a lot of suffering and inhumane death for that animal. HSUS does not consider this method to be acceptable for wild animals. So in terms of designing a community deer problem mitigation plan, here's some of the things we put together into the deer management plan that we've provided for you. You want to always collect local data to indicate the scope of the problem. Every community is different. They have different problems. You want to collect data to really help you define what is the problem, set clear, achievable, and measurable goals. I mean, achievable and measurable. I can't tell you how many communities just don't even bother with that. They set a plan in place and go away. But you want to look, is this going to achieve our goal, and can we measure our achievement? You want to choose measures that are likely to achieve the goals and make sure they're socially acceptable. Will the public, will your residents actually support this? Monitoring is everything. If you're not monitoring how well you're doing with a deer intervention program, then you're really, shame on you for implementing something that you can't tell how well it's working. And you need to clearly spell out for people the long-term costs and the timelines, so they have an idea of what's going to happen when and what's going to be achieved. What we see in most communities, and almost every community I've gone to, and that's been a lot of them, hunting is usually proposed as the best way to manage the problems, but there is no baseline data collected. So there's no starting point. People don't know where they've begun. They don't know the number of complaints. They don't know where the complaints are. They don't know the amount of browsing damage. They just don't have any starting point. So when you have an intervention, they don't know what's been achieved. They usually set overly broad goals that are not measurable or not achievable. We want to reduce deer problems or deer population, but they don't say by how much. They don't say where we're starting from and how we're going to get there. A monitoring system is usually not put in place, so there's no way to know if you've achieved anything, and there's no way to know when a cull has been put in place. Success is usually measured by anecdote. You know, we saw more greenery, or we had less accidents, or, you know, eyeballing the landscape. Now we're seeing more plants that weren't growing before. But this is most frustrating to me, is when communities commit to something, they haven't established that baseline data, and they are not able to monitor and see, have we achieved our goals? You know, here's where we started from, you know, what have we accomplished? So hunting in general, I have found, is not the answer. It will not achieve Lyme disease and other deer problem reduction goals. It's expensive. It requires a continuing financial commitment on the part of the town, which means taxpayer money. It's controversial. There's usually a never-ending cycle of killing, and it's a commitment to a permanent problem. So when I tend to put it all together, what I recommend is that communities develop a comprehensive deer problem mitigation plan, that they use resident surveys and deer collision data to design their plan and involve the stakeholders, have forums, have meetings, invite them to be part of a deer task force, you know, bring them in and educate them about garden conflicts, collision conflicts. You really get good information out there through the website and other information distribution channels, and really focus the non-lethal options, the problem-solving options in a very site-specific manner. You want to identify your hot spots, where problems are occurring, and tailor your solutions to those problems, and set up a solid monitoring system so you know if you're successful or not. You know, did the intervention work? You really need a comprehensive solution. Even if communities adopt fertility control, and there are a number of communities that have gone with fertility control, which John's going to talk about more, that's not it. You can't just do one thing to solve the deer problem. If you're trying to reduce your deer numbers through deer fertility control, you still need to do the other things. You need to help the community lower the food source, do more defensive deer gardening, and other things to reduce conflicts. Austin is a really good model. Austin, Texas, they created a humane, non-lethal, citywide deer conflict management plan. A lot of public education was involved, and their goal was to help people coexist with wildlife, and deer in particular. They gathered complaints, and here are a bunch of them about what people were concerned about, primarily deer eating flowers and garden plants, and they're walking down city streets, and people are feeding them, and they might cause Lyme disease. But what we looked at is most of their most important complaints really could be dealt with to a large extent, maybe not fully, with public education. So there were a lot of things people are concerned about that really they could be educated about to help them. But in Austin, they wanted to get to the source of the problem. When they looked at the complaints, they found that most of them were in the northwest corner of Austin, and there's a lot of green space there, a lot of immigration of deer. But what they also found is despite that, deer were coming across streets, coming across properties, hanging out in people's yards to a great extent in the northwest corner. And it turned out this one neighborhood was just beleaguered. They just had more deer complaints than any other area in all of Austin. So we tried to hone in on that particular neighborhood. And what we found was there was a deer feeder, somebody who was putting out troughs of food for deer all the time and bringing the deer in. They were crossing the streets. At 5 o'clock at night, you could go down a street and you'd literally have to stop for the deer that were crossing. So I recommended they really have a sit down with this guy, explain to him what he's doing is not good for the deer. It's causing all these problems, and it's ultimately going to result in deer being killed with any feeder of animals, whether it's cats or deer or raccoons. People who feed have a greater commitment to it. They believe they're helping the animal, but they're also helping themselves. Psychologically, they need to feed. That makes them feel good, and it's a tough psychological thing to break. So telling this guy he was violating different sorts of state statute and he'd be fined did absolutely no good. He just started removing the troughs and then putting them back out at midnight when nobody was looking, and he knew there would be no enforcement. He was a real tough cookie, and we recommended people have sit-downs with him, really try and bring him around. With provisioners of wildlife, those are the toughest people to get through to, because they do not want to believe that they're doing anything harmful, and they really don't want to stop feeding wildlife because it's bringing them a lot of pleasure. So that was the big problem in this particular community. In Austin, they asked people to send in their issues with deer, but a lot can be gotten from public surveys. What most public surveys do in different communities, they'll send out a survey that says, are you having deer problems, yes or no? How many deer do you want to see? Are there too many deer? Do you want to see less deer? And kind of that's it. So it's not, most communities don't do a thorough job. What surveys should assess is people's attitudes towards deer. Do you like seeing deer? Do you enjoy them? What are the specific problems? Where do they occur and how severe are they? What actions have you taken? Give details. And this is tricky because a person may say, I tried repellents, they didn't work. Well, did they apply the repellents every 2 weeks and after heavy rain? Or did they apply them once and then 2 months later, everything was eaten and they decided they didn't work? We have to be really careful, and this is a problem with public surveys, is it's hard to assess if people really did things properly. And if they didn't take actions and do them properly, yes, that may not have worked. So we want to ask them in public surveys to what extent were their actions perceived by them to be successful. It will give you a starting point for conflict resolution and help you establish baseline data, but you really need to ask enough details so you get a sense of, did they do it right? Because there's a lot of good tools out there, but they have to be implemented in the right way. Rochester Hills, I returned to. They have a great deer program. I just want to flag some of the things I really liked. They're advisory committee consisted primarily of citizens, and most deer advisory committees are front-loaded with all kinds of city and municipal people, agency people. Usually you're lucky if they have one or two public citizens. And I was part of a Westchester County, New York Deer Advisory Committee. There were 35 members, and there was only one public member, which was crazy. And it was impossible to meet with that bigger crowd, and it was impossible to get anything done. But this I liked. It was a lot of citizen members who had expressed different interests in deer, pro, con, hunting, very well-rounded. They had Parks and Forestry Department staff involved. One of those staff members was tasked with implementing the deer program. So Lance DeVoe, the ranger, would go door to door and talk to people about problems they may have with sightlines and roadways, that their bushes were growing up too high and creating potential for accidents. There were some city council members, a youth council member, but it was really a citizens advisory committee, which I haven't seen in many places. They looked at deer complaints, and they tracked them. And as you can see, most of their complaints, the deer car collision and nuisance complaints, went down. Their feeding deer complaints kind of stayed the same, and I think that's a problem because there are more and more deer feeders. But they tried to track what happened with our complaints year to year. They also looked at crash locations and tried to figure out, where do we put up the message boards? Where do we try and get the messaging out? Where are we seeing most of our crashes? And aerial surveys, they charted, how many deer are we tending to see? They weren't committed to absolute numbers. They just were wondering, are we seeing extreme growth rates and reproductive highs or not, or deer kind of staying stable? And they put that all together into their educational materials and their website, going door to door, really trying to get each and every resident on board with reducing deer conflicts and reducing any sort of sightline barriers that would create collisions. They even did things like go to utility companies and ask them to put inserts about deer in their mailings. I don't know how many of us read those, but still. They partnered with garden centers and had workshop days and discounts on different products, and partnered with the drivers' ed programs in the community to try and get new drivers, elderly drivers, really aware of what you need to do to avoid crashing with deer. What I also liked is they put on their website a big gardening component. On the left, you can see they had lists of local, why is that not working? Lists of plants that are more deer resistant, that are sold by the local nurseries. On the right, they did some town plots where they looked, and I'm sorry you can't see them too well, but they looked at plants that deer prefer. They put out town plots. Then they put equal plots of plants that deer prefer that were sprayed with repellents every 2 weeks. And then they looked at deer-resistant plants, and they had plots out through the town, and they looked at what worked. And not surprisingly, the plots that were not protected were browsed heavily by deer, but the plots of plants that deer really like but were protected with repellents properly were protected and did well, and the plants that deer didn't like did well. So they were able to show the community right here in town, look at these pictures. Here's what you need to do to protect flowers and vegetables. Here's what works. Here's our study right here in town. And that was very effective because people, were seeing, oh, gee, if this worked for them right here in town, it can work for me. They recommended some new actions. They used to have don't veer for deer messaging everywhere, but people were bored by that. It's not compelling. So they changed it to high deer crash area. Deer alert, reduce your speed, you may crash. That was more effective. They added solar flashing LED road signs for a trial, and did, again, community outreach, gardening seminars. They did a brochure that goes out to every resident, and more partnerships with local nurseries to get them on board with displays of deer-resistant gardening and discounts on deer-resistant gardening products. So, it's really a community effort that works, and it helps to make the entire community more aware of deer issues and ways to resolve them. So anyway, those are just some samples. I could go on absolutely forever.
Okay, I'm going to move fairly quickly, and Laura has, in our question and answer period, has touched on a lot of things that I'm going to talk about. But like Laura mentioned, the reason that we're here is because the HSUS and animal protection and animal welfare organizations deal with this issue all the time. The HSUS has been working on the deer conflict issue for 30 plus years, and our goal is to create resources that help communities deal with this issue. And it's something that I want to make sure that I am clearly defining or clearly distinguishing between this idea of managing populations and managing conflicts. And what Laura's been talking about and what I'm going to talk about is really sort of switching our perspective and our approach to managing the conflicts themselves, to mitigating that and thinking about it in that context. And that's where so much confusion occurs, because most of the wildlife agencies and most of the way that we hear about addressing conflicts with deer in our daily lives are about this one-to-one reduction in conflict by reduction in the number of deer. And as Laura said, it's nearly impossible for a community to depopulate its herd or its groups of deer. It's just not something that's ethical, and it's not something that's sustainable. And the sort of money and resources necessary to do that aren't available. So I want to be clear as we go through this, and if there's any questions about that, we can get to them at the end. But we're obviously here to discuss this new template, this deer conflict management plan. And again, it's at www.humanesociety.org, resources, what to do about deer. So you can look up HSUS, what to do about deer, and find it. It's this 40-page or so template with a lot of appendices, with an appendix that has a lot of resources in it that we hope to add to as we get information from communities and as we develop the resources in an ongoing way. So this is something that it's not unique to Pennsylvania. It's not unique to any place, unfortunately, anymore in the U.S. Deer have a tremendous range over the United States, and since the early 90s have been something that communities have been reporting as an issue. I mean, the Humane Society of the United States, for one, gets hundreds and hundreds of calls a year about, just from communities that are experiencing these kinds of conflicts, where people are taking sides, where the community is polarized, where there's one side versus the people that like the deer versus people that don't care so much or don't want the deer around. And they're the sort of the public who maybe know only a little bit or only concerned about certain issues. And then some of the public officials who are getting these calls all the time and who are really sort of wrestling and grappling with these complaints within their community. And this is a very good example, and this is called Urban Deer Contraception: The 7 Stages of Grief. And it was principally written about the contraception and contraception as a tool for managing conflicts with deer. But Jay Kirkpatrick and John Turner were some of the principal scientists who developed immunocontraception approaches that are efficacious in causing infertility in deer. And they wrote this somewhat entertaining satire, and they published it in the Wildlife Society Bulletin in 1997. And at this point in their careers, they were already very seasoned, and very sort of cynical about this idea that these conflicts are constantly recycling. And it's not just the deer-human conflict, it's the human-to-human conflict. And it's this every year, and every community across the U.S., this kind of thing comes back up. The deer conflict presents itself, it raises its ugly head, and the community leaders hear about it. There's some discussion, and they identify those kinds of parallels, and of course this is our experience as well. And what our approach is, we know now that without a plan to address the conflicts with deer, that's really focused on conflicts, the conflicts are going to arise regardless of any kind of ongoing population control. The complaints are going to continue. There's going to be controversy. There are protests and angry presentations at town meetings, and the pitting of neighbor against neighbor. So what we want to happen is, even if there is ongoing population control through culling or through sharpshooting or through some other form of lethal management, we still think it's really, really important to have these kinds of plans in place so that there is better education, there's better understanding about how to address conflicts. Because even if those populations are being managed and somewhat reduced, there's still going to be conflicts. They're still going to persist. And what we want to do is reduce, at the very least, reduce unnecessary killing of deer, especially the kind that can be avoided through basic conflict resolution, basic species-specific conflict resolution that comes through this sort of development of public education through the community channels that exist. So it's just some basic premises and assumptions about some of this issue in general before we get going here. So deer populations were driven to historic lows in the not too distant past, and this, along with commercial overhunting of many other wildlife species, led to the establishment of special protections codified in game laws. But by the 1900s, there were only about 350,000 animals remaining in isolated areas of deer. The restoration of deer is a management success. It's largely, it's maybe the most successful restoration of any species in the U.S. Just by the metric of abundance. So considerable expense and effort went into that restoration, and more than one generation of deer biologists worked toward the goals of restoration for their entire career. So those restoration programs began in the late 1800s. They led to deer population comebacks by the 1990s, or probably the U.S. deer population was somewhere around 26 million animals. So from 350,000 to 26 million animals. And so both the science as well as practice of deer management was, and to a large extent still is, it's really focused on increasing populations and creating better habitat for deer. So this whole sort of effort on behalf of our wildlife agency approach is based on increasing population and increasing habitat for deer. So trying to turn that process around and think about how to address what we have now, or which of these are communities that hunting isn't always that easy or wanted. And it may not take care of conflicts that are actually occurring with residents. So how do you turn that process around? And really it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around, and by the time you realize it needs to be done, it's going to be quite impossible for quite some time. So obviously that restoration has a lot to do with the ability of deer populations to grow pretty quickly and expand in their range. And of course that ability is really attributed to the way we have provided so much of our urban areas, how we've developed and urbanized these areas. It's made it so attractive, these kinds of edge habitats that Laura was talking about that are perfectly suited for deer. Really, we've had, from their perspective, this incredible habitat success for deer. This ideal deer habitat, the mixture of forest and field with new secondary growth, and these kinds of habitat predominate in urban areas. So again, deer management has been traditionally grounded in the concept of a sustained yield, with hunters seeking the largest and oldest males and reluctantly hunting females, if at all. And of course, the females are a demographically significant component of the population. And deer hunting, as Laura pointed out, is the economic engine that underpins most of state wildlife agencies and their work. So hunting, as I said, may not be practical, desirable, or even feasible within the urban and suburban matrix where deer are now found. And Laura mentioned that bow hunting is often argued, or sharpshooting is often argued as one answer in urban areas, but it does for us, for animal protection organizations, animal welfare organizations, it raises significant concerns about animal welfare and its high crippling and wounding rates. And even with modern bows, the rate is estimated to be about 18%, and often it's higher. So for that to happen, really an extended discussion about the ethics of bow hunting would have to include a discussion about how an individual will become skilled without first being non-skilled. So the animal protection welfare community, we're always going to oppose that and other practices that cause avoidable suffering, and that's what we're getting at here. There's a lot of avoidable suffering that can be produced. So what are some of the realities we all face and some of the hopes? So hunting is probably going to continue to be used as a means of controlling urban deer populations for economic reasons, if for no other, and that's going to happen and continue to happen in many places. And what we're calling for, though, what our hope is that urban deer control becomes more comprehensive and that more communities implement a holistic and integrated approach. And this is the condition we feel should exist, but of course it rarely does. And then ultimately, people in affected communities will make decisions about deer management. Community members will and do have some say in the way deer management occurs, and they must have choices. They must have access to alternate means of control and more and better education about resolving conflicts in the first place. So, with all that in mind, what are the minimal conditions that urban deer programs must meet from an animal protection point of view? And on this, when I'm talking about urban deer programs, this is about programs that include lethal control, potentially. So they've got to be humane. The public demands that wild animals be treated humanely and not be killed or made to suffer unnecessarily. Second, they must be justified. The reasoning behind them must be sound, and they have to be achievable. They have to be effective, the method. They have to be efficient, and they have to be able to be open to evaluation. And these programs have to be evaluated regularly and constantly demonstrated to be justified. I mean, what typically happens is that hunts and culls become institutionalized and becomes, this is the way we're doing it out of tradition, or that becomes more about just sort of maintenance, like, you know, akin to sort of mowing the grass. And what we've gotten away from in the way that we look at managing deer or deer conflicts is the idea that it's the one-to-one population, like if you reduce deer population, you reduce conflicts, without thinking about what has really the classical approach to pest management, or called integrated pest management, is that as you take this a comprehensive approach and you make sure that you not only you're species specific, that you've assembled information on biology and ecology, that you're monitoring damage, but that you determine the damage threshold, so that you determine, and what I think is really important here in this classic approach is that the emphasis is on evaluation, that you don't act unless a threshold for action has been crossed, that there is some sort of conflict or something that's causing somebody a problem that cannot be resolved in a non-lethal way, then you only act until that isn't possible anymore. So you, as a community or as a site, you determine that damage threshold, and then you choose the management option based on what's going to be the most effective. And efficient and the most humane and justified. So this is a really good underpinning. It's a way to start. It doesn't get at all of it, but it is an important thing to sort of consider that we do this with many species, but we don't do it with deer. We don't take this approach, the management, wildlife management sort of agencies and the components that sort of drive this, the academic side of it. They don't take this approach when it necessarily comes to deer. And so what we wanted to do is, and what's been coming together for many years, decades actually, is this idea of a more comprehensive framework. And this is something that this paper called the International Consensus Principles for Ethical Wildlife Control is something that was published in 2017, and I was lucky enough to be a part of this as part of a stakeholder representative as well as an author. And what it did was really capture all of the things that we think are really important when it comes to sort of thinking about managing wildlife and approaching wildlife and resolving wildlife issues and resolving the conflicts with them. And a lot of this management approaches were being codified in the field of vertebrate pest control in the 90s, but that was thanks mostly to Australia and New Zealand, who kill enormous numbers of animals in an attempt to protect their own native species. So they do have some understanding of these issues, but they were never really completely captured. And as you saw in the integrated pest management framework, they weren't all there. But this is really the first time that it was brought together, all together, sort of including the ethics of it all, and not just one country or one organization's position. This is an international consensus and a consensus among animal welfare protection organizations on how to approach wildlife control issues. So here they are. So number one, modify human practices to get to the root cause, control attractants, for instance. This also implies the need for long-term education, as Laura mentioned, being very important. Justify that substantial harm is being caused to people with evidence, and that requires reconciling real harms and conflicting values. Number three, wildlife control actions should be clear, achievable, and monitored and adapted based on lessons learned. Four, control methods should be predictable and effectively cause the least animal welfare harms. Five, decisions to control should be informed by the range of community values alongside scientific, technical, and practical information. And six, decision to control wildlife should be integrated into a program of long-term systematic management, not some kind of ad hoc knee-jerk reactions that we tend to see in the kind of community work that we do. And finally, and importantly, decision to control should be based on specifics of the situation, not negative labels, not negative about being overabundant or introduced or a nuisance or pest. Those kinds of labels tend to get in the way of actually being able to resolve conflicts effectively. So those 7 principles that are just discussed and are part of that international framework are present here in the management and coexistence plan for white-tailed deer, and it really underpins it. So again, we've been talking about it here this evening, but we have just finished it, and we're really intended to be used by communities, cities, villages, towns, counties, homeowners associations to try to implement in their community and try to better educate the people within their community. So that's something I invite you to try to use it, and if you have any questions about it, please reach out to us and keep abreast of what's happening on our What to Do About Deer pages so that you can stay informed about what kind of resources are available for your community. So the goals of the Deer Conflict Management Plan are to provide this framework for evaluating community issues with white-tailed deer, and it's to recommend step-by-step actions that address each conflict through a comprehensive, practical, effective, science-based, humane, long-term, and community-supported plan. So the end result of putting this in place is that a community that's more knowledgeable and better equipped to coexist with deer. That's our hope, and even actually other wildlife. And this idea of existing in the same time and mutual tolerance despite different interests, and that's something that we work pretty hard on as far as providing resources and sort of engagement for different situations, including beaver, coyotes, geese, and then the whole gamut of urban wildlife species. So we have a lot of that information on our website if you're interested, that if your community is grappling with other species-specific conflicts. But the approach is the same. The idea is that you take on this, you get to the root cause, you educate the public, and you take steps in a really stepwise fashion. So the table of contents, and just to sort of quickly review it, I'm not going to go too deeply into it because obviously you have a copy of it. But so where we will add to it the idea of it being a sort of a living document. To this other page here. As we go through it, the plan lays out in detail the root of these conflicts and reviews these issues and how to address each of them specifically. And again, that goal is of this plan is to provide a framework for evaluating community deer issues and taking a step-by-step action, which address those deer issues in a really comprehensive way. So we're going through this, the roots of conflicts between deer and people. It describes that. It talks about yard and garden complaints and how to address those, and sort of frames those so that there's a better understanding, and then those are able to be parts of community education pieces. It addresses Lyme disease concerns, and of course Laura spent some time on that, what to do about aggressive deer, and how to consider and what to do about biodiversity loss and forest regeneration issues. So many communities get mired in arguments about how many deer they have and how many deer they want, and they lose sight of the more sort of effective and less costly and more publicly acceptable way to manage deer conflicts. And the comprehensive approach is there's no one solution to conflicts with deer. A good deer conflict mitigation program will be comprehensive and multifaceted, and that's our attempt here. And again, as we've said over and over again tonight, the focus needs to be on managing the deer conflicts themselves and not those deer numbers. So the crucial elements. The focus for an effective deer conflict management plan needs to be on addressing the root cause. And it needs to do this using an adaptive management framework. So the first part of this is focus needs to be on assessing and defining your community's specific deer-related conflicts. And that gets down into the localization and seriousness of the conflict. And then those goals need to be tailored to address the specific conflicts and clear benchmarks to assess those program successes. And we want to use strategies that provide long-term benefits. We want to avoid the kind of quick fix strategies that are so ubiquitous now. And we want to create an ongoing monitoring program, a program that is really vital for assessing whether the program has achieved its goals and seeing what changes need to be made. That's something that's one of the, well, almost always these are missed, but the first one that typically the community doesn't gather data. They don't understand what's going on in their community about who has what conflicts and where they're occurring. And then, the goals aren't set, and maybe they're not even achievable. Maybe they're not even measurable. But even if that is done, what has to be done is this ongoing monitoring program. Is it being successful? And we rarely see a program that's doing all of those things. So it really, really crucial. And it's got to clearly spell out the long-term costs and the timeline. So the public needs to know how much public money is supporting the program over what time period and where and when the activities will occur. And most crucial for us as well, something that we see time and time again, is that the public has to be part of that process. They've got to be solicited for their input. They've got to be brought into it and informed, and they've got to be part of these meetings and a part of the decisions, because if they're not, what we typically see is programs just break apart. The same kinds of issues erupt, people being in disagreement or people not being on the same page, and you don't have that kind of broad-based stakeholder agreement that keeps these kinds of plans in place and moving along, to really try to address the problem. And that's the kind of thing that we hear from communities all the time, that they didn't get buy-in, and they didn't last very long. They spent a lot of money, and it didn't work, and they still have deer problems, and they still have misunderstandings about what their conflicts look like and how to address them. So the template lays out the step-by-step guide to putting a plan in place. And again, we want to clearly outline the communities, the deer-related conflicts, and their attempt to solve them in a site-specific manner. So gather the local data, creating map overlays. Step 3, creating public input channels. Step 4, creating the action plan, utilizing a range of non-lethal options first. And then setting up a program to assess and monitor for success. So gathering local data, as sort of Laura reviewed this, conducting the resident surveys, getting good information, good survey, non-biased survey, getting as much detailed information as you can, collecting deer vehicle collision data, using some sort of complaint reporting system, collecting info on location and type of deer attractants, and assessing the deer habitat, and identifying any deer feeding stations or issues with people feeding deer. So we have some examples of public surveys in the appendix, and we're going to add some more as we get more information from communities that are using surveys and successfully and getting good information. And the map overlays, plotting this type of data really will help you get a clear picture of where your community-specific deer conflicts are and what solutions can be applied in that site-specific manner, and helping people understand better in that community what's going on out there and what not to do. And step 3, creating those public input channels. And this sort of first 3 part, the conducting the resident survey, setting up a deer task force, having an open public forum, that sort of constitutes the evaluation phase, the initial phase. And then you want to provide that information back to the public so they're more aware of what their community looks like and what the community feels or how they feel about that. The conflicts that are occurring and the way and where they're occurring in their community. And then step 4, creating an action plan. If one of, which it will likely be, if there's deer damage to gardens is identified as a significant issue, putting a public education process in place. Laura mentioned host deer-resistant gardening workshops, promoting the deer-resistant flower and ornamental specials in all the community displays, set up the town study plots, and host deer-proofing demonstration days. Step 4, create an action plan continued. So for deer vehicle collisions, do educational outreach. Once this local deer collision data has been collected and analyzed, these solutions can be applied. You want to be really careful about collecting as much data here as you can if this is a significant issue, because it certainly can be. But setting up and maintaining an accident reporting system is incredibly important, as well as understanding where these collision hotspots are and setting up a response to them based on knowing where they are. Again, step 4, sort of continue to create that action plan. The plan also has these sort of details and resources and information about addressing all these issues as part of this plan. What to do with deer feeders, what to do about Lyme disease, more information about that issue and how the public can become better aware of how deer might be related to it and how to take precautions to prevent. And also biodiversity issues, aggressive habituated deer, and orphan fawns. And finally, step 5, setting up a program assessment and monitoring system. Again, the template has appendices that detail sample complaint and collision reporting forms. And I'm hoping that you can take a look at them and plan and try to incorporate elements of it in your own community. And again, we'd certainly appreciate any of that feedback once you have read through it. And if you have any questions about that, how to implement it. We'd certainly like to hear from you about that as well. And so again, like getting to this point of putting this sort of plan in place so that you can mitigate conflicts and so that you can build consensus within your community and help them understand how to address some of these issues and really sort of how to think about some of these issues, what really constitutes a conflict and how you might address it without having to address it lethally. When it becomes apparent or when the community there is a consensus that they think control needs to be put in place, what are those options? And there are lethal control options that may be ongoing, sharpshooting, and something that the community has to work with or has to deal with, and how to try to minimize. One of the things that's on the sort of horizon is fertility control, and the idea of reducing population if necessary and justified using fertility control. And what we're seeing right now in the field is that if you look on page, there's some good information. I just want to draw your attention to it on page 28. It gives a good overview of where we are with deer fertility control, and essentially what we've done and what the field has done is that immunocontraception and the use of PZP is been proven, and it's been over now decades has proven to be efficacious and deliverable in the field, and really the only kind of roadblocks that exist right now are political. And we are, hoping that communities can help sort of better understand what and how something like a fertility control approach might work for them, if sort of population reduction is justified, and help with that kind of political support in moving those advancing that kind of tool forward so that it's available for communities to use. But right now, it's for instance, PZP is approved for use by the EPA, and now it has to go from state to state to be approved for use before communities can use it. And then also, the State Wildlife Agency would have to approve its use as far as being part of a deer control program. And so there's those sort of political, those sort of necessary things need to be sort of gone through and accomplished before it can be delivered to the community and as sort of a ready to go tool that's can be readily applied in a control program. So any questions about that? I don't want to. Any questions about the fertility control aspects? And that's really it, actually. I know Laura basically covered it, and I'm being fairly redundant, but if you have any questions about this plan or want more information about it or what we're doing in regard to providing these resources, please feel free to reach out, and I think close that here. Thank you again for coming. I appreciate it.